After 20 years of designing contemporary architecture, I finally got the chance to design something completely different. A traditional home. And not just any traditional home. I designed a Spanish revival home. This project has been really interesting change of pace for me because almost my entire career has been focused on contemporary architecture. So today, I want to take you behind the scenes and show you how this house came together from the first sketch to the final design. And what you're watching here is actually about 3 months of work condensed into roughly 13 minutes. So let's get into it. The clients for this house have a much more traditional lifestyle. Honestly, a contemporary house just didn't make sense for them. This is going to be their last home as they're approaching retirement, so I wanted to create something that really fits the way they want to live. They want a home that's comfortable, warm, traditional, and most importantly, a place where they can host and entertain family and friends. The program is pretty ambitious. We are designing a 2-story house with a basement, a pool, an entertaining area, and an ADU with an attached garage. And interestingly, the ADU and garage are going to be built first. So there are a lot of moving pieces in this project. When we started talking about the architectural style, the clients wanted to explore Spanish Revival. Spanish Revival emerged in the late 19th century and really took off during the design boom of the 1920s and 1930s, especially in places like California and Florida. Architects at that time were romanticizing this idea of a pastoral Spanish past, but they weren't simply copying old buildings. They were taking those historical ideas and adapting them to a modern lifestyle. And that's exactly what the clients wanted to do. Spanish Revival architecture can have this beautiful, smooth, light color stucco walls, asymmetrical and sprawling floor plans, larger windows, and a stronger connection between the inside and outside. It's really about relaxed living and entertaining. And then you get into the details. The craftsmanship can be incredible. Wrought iron, hand-painted ceramic tiles, azulejos, and Moorish-inspired patterns. High vaulted ceilings. Exposed decorative beams. And beautiful polished mahogany millwork. There's a lot of opportunity to make this house feel handcrafted and special. Now, this entire project started with a hand drawing. And I really enjoy starting projects this way. There's something about putting a pencil on iPad that allows me to think freely. I am not worried about layers, line weights, commands, or whether something is modeled correctly. I am just trying to solve the problem. The computer is incredibly powerful, and later in the process, it's going to allow me to develop and detail this project much faster. But for me, the hand drawing is where I can make decisions quickly. It's almost like having a conversation with the building. I actually started this sketch using an old school blueprint motif. At first, I was thinking about this almost like a traditional construction drawing. I wanted to lay everything out and understand how the pieces were going to fit together. But as the design developed, I started changing strategies. I realized that I wasn't trying to create construction drawings at this stage. I was trying to design, so I started allowing the drawings to become more expressive, more about the architecture, more about the proportions, the spaces, the experience, and less about making the drawing look like something you will hand to a contractor. You might notice that there are moments where I just stop drawing. Those pauses are intentional. That's actually me thinking. Sometimes the hardest part of designing isn't drawing. It's figuring out what to draw next. I'll stare at the drawing, walk away, come back to it, erase something, rethink a room, and then suddenly the solution appears. So when you see these pauses in the video, that's what's happening. I am trying to solve a problem. This house actually went through 7 different versions. And that's something people don't always see when they look at the final architectural drawing. They see the finished product and think that's the design. But there's usually a whole graveyard of ideas that came before it. Versions that didn't work. Ideas that looked good but didn't function. Spaces that needed to move. Proportions that weren't right. For this video, I'm showing you versions 6 and 7. These are the 2 versions that where the design really started to come together. And these are the versions that are going to move forward into the final build design. One thing I wanted to do differently with this house was the color palette. When most people think about Spanish Revival architecture, they often picture a very white or pale Spanish style house. And that's beautiful, but I wanted to take the design in a slightly different direction. I wanted the colors to feel more Latino, warmer, richer, more expressive. Rather than creating another white Spanish-style house, I wanted to bring in colors that feel connected to Latin America culture and the way these homes can actually be lived in. It's still Spanish Revival, but it's my interpretation of Spanish Revival. And probably one of the biggest drivers of the design is entertaining. The clients want this to be a home where people gather. So I'm thinking about how the kitchen connects to the living spaces, how people move from the house to the pool. That's one of the things I really love about Spanish Revival architecture. The style lends itself naturally to this indoor-outdoor lifestyle. Courtyards, patios, terraces, covered outdoor spaces, underground party space. The architecture can feel less like a box sitting on a property and more like a series of spaces connected together. The ADU and attached garage are going to be constructed first, which makes them an important part of the overall planning. Even though it's a separate structure, I don't want it to feel like an afterthought. It needs to belong to the same architectural family as the main house. Same language, similar materials, similar proportions, but it also has to function independently. So we are balancing the architectural character with the practical requirements of the project. And of course, all of this has to work within the real world. This isn't just an exercise in drawing something that looks good. That design follows Los Angeles zoning, building and safety, and California building code requirements. So while I'm sketching freely, I'm constantly thinking about the practical side of the project: setbacks, building height, lot coverage, egress, structure, accessibility, fire and life safety. All the things that ultimately determine whether the building can actually be built. That's one of the interesting things about architectural design. You have this creative idea, and then reality comes along and says, okay, now figure out how to build it. At version 6, the major pieces are starting to work. But there's still a lot to resolve. And then we get to version 7. This is where things really start to click. The proportions become more intentional. The spaces become clearer. The exterior begins to have a stronger identity. And we're getting much closer to the house that we're actually going to build. It's interesting because sometimes the final version doesn't look dramatically different from the previous version. But behind those small changes are a lot of decisions: moving a wall 6 inches, changing a window, adjusting a roof, reworking a staircase, changing the relationship between 2 rooms. Those little decisions can completely change how a house feels. This hand drawing isn't the final construction documentation. It's the design that we're going to take into the next phase. From here, we're moving into design development. The computer will become much more important at this stage. I'll develop the plans, elevations, sections, materials, details, structure, and all of the things necessary to turn this idea into an actual building. But this is where the project started: a pencil, an iPad, and a lot of thinking. After 20 years of designing contemporary architecture, this project has been a really fun challenge for me. It's giving me the opportunity to go back to some of the traditional architectural ideas that I haven't explored in a long time, but also reinterpret them through my own experience as a contemporary architect. The goal isn't to build a house that feels like it was frozen in the 1920s. It's to take the spirit of Spanish Revival, the craftsmanship, the materials, the courtyards, the indoor-outdoor living, the warmth, and create a home that works for this family today. And now, we're going to take this drawing and turn it into a real house. So if you want to follow along and see how this goes from the hand sketch, design development, construction, make sure you follow the project. This is version 7, and hopefully this is the house we're going to build.